History has a way of repeating itself, especially in the Middle East. 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 shook the world, not just militarily, but economically, sending oil prices through the roof and leaving global economies reeling. Fast forward to today, and once again, the region is a flashpoint. Iran has launched its biggest assault on Israel in decades. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, could this be the beginning of another global crisis, one that echoes the seismic oil shock of the 1970s? In this video, we explore the eerie similarities between then and now, and what the economic fallout could mean for the rest of the world. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 remains one of the most significant conflicts in modern Middle Eastern history, marking a pivotal moment for both regional geopolitics and global economics. The war broke out on October 6, 1973, when a coalition of Arab states, led by Egypt and Syria, launched a surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The war lasted nearly 3 weeks and ended in a ceasefire brokered by the United Nations. Militarily, it reshaped regional dynamics, but its greatest impact was felt through the Arab oil embargo that followed. In retaliation for US support of Israel during the conflict, Arab oil-producing nations imposed an oil embargo on the West. The embargo quadrupled oil prices and led to widespread stagflation, a period of high inflation coupled with stagnant economic growth. Global economies, especially in the West, were severely affected, leading to fuel shortages, long lines at gas stations, and a restructuring of global energy policies. The Yom Kippur War taught the world that conflict in the Middle East could directly lead to global economic disruptions, particularly through energy markets. Fast forward to the present, tensions are flaring again in the region. Just before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Iran launched its largest attack on Israel since the Yom Kippur War. This attack, marked by the firing of over 180 missiles into Israeli territory, has sent shockwaves through the region and raised concerns about a new Middle Eastern crisis with global economic ramifications. While today's geopolitical and economic landscape is different, there are echoes of the past, particularly in the potential impact on energy markets. Oil, as it did in 1973, remains a critical indicator of geopolitical risk. After a year of rising tensions and sporadic violence in the Middle East, oil prices remained relatively stable due to an oversupply in the global market and weak demand as economies slowly recovered from the pandemic. However, the events of early October, including the Hamas-led attacks on Israel and Iran's missile strikes, triggered a sharp 5% spike in oil prices, the largest increase in 12 months. This spike demonstrates that while oil markets today are more diversified and resilient than they were in 1973, the region's volatility still has the potential to disrupt global energy flows. In 1973, oil prices surged by 233% in the year following the Yom Kippur War. Although today's spike pales in comparison, the risks of further escalation remain real. Whether we see a prolonged price increase will depend on how the conflict unfolds, particularly if Iran, a major oil producer, becomes more directly involved in a war with Israel. One potential flashpoint is the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point for global oil shipments. Around 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow waterway, making it a strategic asset for Iran, which has previously threatened to block the strait in times of conflict. If Iran attempts to close the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for Israeli strikes or US involvement, the impact on global oil markets could be catastrophic. Even with today's more diversified energy sources, including natural gas and renewables, a prolonged disruption in the flow of oil from the Gulf would almost certainly lead to soaring energy prices, just as it did in the 1970s. In addition to the direct threat to oil supplies, the region's broader instability could lead to other indirect economic consequences. For example, Israel's retaliatory strikes in Lebanon, which resulted in the death of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, have already escalated tensions across the region. Tehran had previously warned of retaliation after a Hamas political leader was killed in Iran earlier this year, leading to fears that this conflict could quickly spread beyond Israel and Gaza, pulling in Lebanon, Syria, and possibly other regional players. Unlike in 1973, the global economy is now more interconnected, and disruptions in one part of the world can have cascading effects on others. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo hit Western economies hard, but the impact was largely contained to fuel shortages and inflation. Today, with fragile post-pandemic recoveries and already high inflation, a significant spike in energy prices could lead to another round of economic stagnation, especially in Europe and the US, where inflation has been a persistent issue. However, there are differences between the economic environments of 1973 and today. For one, the global energy market is far more diversified, and many countries have strategic oil reserves that can be tapped in times of crisis. Moreover, the global economy is less reliant on oil than it was 50 years ago, thanks to the rise of alternative energy sources. But while these factors provide a buffer, they do not eliminate the risks. Oil remains an essential commodity, and its supply is still heavily concentrated in a region prone to conflict. Some analysts argue that while oil prices may rise in the short term, a full-blown crisis akin to the 1973 oil shock is unlikely. They point to the fact that, despite the violence, oil prices are still down 11.5% since October 7th. However, this optimism may be premature. The situation remains fluid, and as tensions rise, the possibility of further supply disruptions looms large. Any direct involvement by Iran in the conflict could change the calculus, especially if Israel targets Iran's oil infrastructure, which accounts for a significant portion of Tehran's budget. In the broader context, this latest conflict serves as a reminder that the Middle East remains a region of strategic importance to the global economy. While the 1973 oil embargo fundamentally reshaped global energy policies, today's tensions highlight that energy security is still closely tied to regional stability. The difference is that the global economy is now more agile and capable of adapting to short-term shocks, though the long-term consequences of a prolonged conflict remain unpredictable. Looking ahead, the world will be closely watching how the situation unfolds. If the conflict escalates further, particularly with more direct involvement from regional powers like Iran, the potential for significant economic fallout grows. For now, the market reactions, while sharp, have been relatively contained. Stocks, bonds, and oil all saw fluctuations in response to the attacks, but these stabilized as investors weighed the broader macroeconomic picture, which remains dominated by inflation concerns and interest rate cuts in major economies like the US and China.